Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. The shutdown of critical infrastructure on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, Portugal, Andorra, as well as in parts of the French Republic, has reminded us of the vulnerability of modern infrastructure, networks, to any possible attack or accident. Although government officials say they have not yet noticed any signs of a cyber attack for the population of Portugal and Spain, this attack has truly caused panic. The metro, airports, banks were not functioning. Practically, the entire infrastructure of the three countries was paralyzed. And of course, mobile network operators stopped working. There were serious disruptions in access to calls and the internet. Thus, the situation became truly critical. And this is despite the fact that in all three countries, the reasons for what is happening are not well understood. Yes, of course, one can talk about a failure in the European power grid. However, it is necessary to remember that such a failure can always be orchestrated. And we know very well the country that is quite capable of organizing such a failure, especially since Russian leaders in recent months, amid their constant negotiations with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, accuse Europe of aggression and the desire to undermine security, continuing Russia's expansionist war. It is clear that such disruptions can lead to much more significant consequences than those we are witnessing today. Even now, people literally trapped in the subways of Lisbon or Madrid might not find it amusing or be in the mood to analyze the possible causes and consequences of the power outage. In a situation where the West has not considered the vulnerability of its own infrastructure to hostile attacks for decades, one is reminded of the period after September 11th in the United States. At that time, it also became apparent that the entire Western security system was vulnerable to international terrorism. We well remember how explosions were organized incidentally in almost the same cities and countries that are now on the brink of an energy collapse. How terrorist acts were carried out in Madrid at the Atocha station, and how serious the problems were in France. And all this once again reminded us that at that time, both the United States and the countries of the European Union were completely unprepared for a terrorist offensive. And yet, it was not about attacks by states with such a powerful offensive infrastructure as the Russian Federation, but about terrorist groups that were preparing their strikes from somewhere in Afghanistan. It is clear that Russia is a much more serious and, most importantly, ruthless adversary, one that does not hesitate to sacrifice human lives to achieve certain political goals. At the very least, the number of citizens of the Russian Federation who have already died in Russia's war against Ukraine, which evokes virtually no emotions or empathy from either Russian President Vladimir Putin or the overwhelming majority of his compatriots, easily suggests how many lives in states hostile to Russia the Kremlin is willing to sacrifice to prove its hegemony on the continent. Hegemony, one of the paths to which is Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine. And now we see a crisis quite far from this war. Spain and Portugal, it would seem, are at the bottom of the list of countries that should be concerned about Russia's ongoing aggression and Moscow's plans to seize former Soviet republics and establish its own sphere of influence in Central European countries. Relations with Russia have never created serious problems for Spain and Portugal, primarily due to the geographical distance of these countries from one of the most brutal empires of the past and one of the most aggressive states of the present. But the distance, as we can see, is rapidly decreasing. If it is possible to organize disruptions in the European power grid and lead to infrastructure failures, then it can be clearly stated that Poland and Portugal have the same problems and the same ruthless adversary who aims to achieve the goals set by Lubyanka back in the early 90s by misleading the American leadership when the decision was made to seize power in the Russian Federation and further advance Moscow's positions in the post-Soviet space. When discussing the possibilities of counteraction, it must be clearly understood that without a serious reformatting of the regime in Russia, no one in Europe can feel at ease. The words of former French President General Charles de Gaulle, who dreamed of a Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok, turn out to be prophetic. But it is unlikely that the French general considered that a Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok could be controlled from Moscow, and that plans would be made in the Russian capital to destabilize the situation on the European continent and subjugate European countries to Moscow's will, which is ready to engage in dialogue with a completely new Washington for this purpose. So, if we truly want a safe Europe, then this Europe definitely should not stretch from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Between this Europe and Russia, on the border between Russia and Ukraine, there should be a wall that Russian aggression simply cannot spill over onto the European continent. Such a wall of civilization against barbarism. And even if we do not currently obtain any concrete evidence of the involvement of Russian special services and hackers in the power outage in Spain and Portugal, this is by no means a reason to relax and not prepare for the worst. And the worst is already at the doorstep of Europe, which does not agree that one of the countries neighboring the European continent so brazenly and unflinchingly violates international law, destroys peaceful cities, and convinces the American leadership of the correctness and reasonableness of its barbaric approaches to foreign policy, and the very understanding of the so-called spheres of influence and of states in the modern world, as if it came from the distant Middle Ages, when few were ceremonious with neighbors and thought about international law. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it. My social networks are subscribed, as well as channels on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatello, which help develop these resources using the sponsorship feature on YouTube itself.